The P-40 is one of my favourite subjects to build in model form, and when I got my hands on the Academy P-40B Warhawk kit, I thought that I would give it a go. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review possibly one of the worst P-40s in 1/72nd scale. For a deeper dive inside the box of this kit, check out my dedicated unboxing video I've already made on that topic. In this video, I'll be focusing on what this kit is like to build and rounding off with a review on the end. As usual, I'll put a list of the products I used on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to go and get if you fancy replicating what you see here. But without any further ado, let's get into this one. As usual, parts are cut from the sprue using my cutters, and then any rough areas sanded down with a sanding stick. There are some mould seams and a bit of flash on this kit, so a little bit of work had to be taken just to clean them up. There are also some ejector pin marks, but I won't really bother dealing with them as they're not really in visible places. Tamiya extra thin cement will be my glue of choice throughout this build, and the first step was to glue together the components which build up the cockpit. The cockpit is incredibly simple, featuring a floor, a control stick and a chair, and that's pretty much it. You do get a pilot, but I'll add him much later on. I then glued this cockpit assembly into place on its mounting points inside one of the fuselage halves. A very crude control panel is also included, and this was glued into place at the front of the cockpit. And now to get some paint on the model. I'm going to use this Outlaw Paints Interior Green. This lacquer-based paint was loaded straight into the airbrush and then applied to the cockpit areas straight onto the bare plastic. I find that this paint sticks pretty well to bare plastic and dries incredibly quickly. It might not be the perfect shade of green for a P-40, but it'll do. After this, some Vallejo black would be used to pick out some of the select details inside of the cockpit, including the control column and the control panel. Now I'm going to move on to assembling the propeller components. A retaining pin goes in the back of the base plate. The propeller is added to this, and then the spinner as well. I don't want to add it to the model quite yet though, so what I'm going to do is just remove the back of the mounting pin so I can add it after painting. I do need to make sure that I add this component which actually allows you to mount the propeller onto the nose. In this clip you can also see that I've already included the air intake components on the lower side of the nose. I then joined the two fuselage halves together, and the fit is generally okay, but there is a small seam that may need to be addressed. A little bit of sanding should help bring everything into alignment and make it look a little smoother. I'm now going to move on to the wings. I've also painted the internal surface of the wing in the internal green, just in case you can see it from the cockpit, but I don't think you can in the end. The upper and the lower wing surfaces were glued onto this lower wing. The wings were then glued onto the fuselage. It kind of fits, but there is a bit of a gap at the wing roots, and also the sort of mounting position isn't perfectly sized, so there are little bits of the plane which sort of overhang on other bits as well. I added the components which replicate the bulges at the front of the landing gear bays, and then moved on to the tail surfaces. Just like the wings, they're not sized perfectly, so they are actually slightly bigger than the mounting points. And you can see a little bit of overlap where it meets the fuselage. This aircraft comes with raised or lowered landing gear options, so I've decided to go for the lowered option in this particular case because no display stand is included. The tail wheel bay was glued into place, and then the wheel glued into the hole in the bay. I then added the landing gear covers in their open positions on the main landing gear bays. This would be followed by gluing in the landing gear legs into the holes in the landing gear bays. I'm going to glue this all together now for a good plastic to plastic bond. it shouldn't be too hard to paint this when I get to that stage in the build. There are slots for the nose machine guns to be mounted. These are very crude and don't really fit into these slots perfectly, but nonetheless they were glued into position. A bomb is included in this kit. You do get the option of a drop tank if you would prefer. I decided I would go for the bomb, and it comes in two halves which need to be glued together. I then attached the mounting points, which will be glued onto the aircraft later. Now, to address a few little gaps and things, I'm going to use this putty surfacer, which was carefully painted into the offending areas, primarily around the wing roots. A few thin coats of this would be applied, and then it would be sanded as smooth as I could get it, just to help tidy it up and make it look a little better. And now it's time to prime. I'm going with this Army Painter black primer. You'll notice that I've already masked the cockpit canopy, the cockpit area, and the other components are also receiving a coat of this paint. With that done, I'm going to use this Curtis Grey from Vallejo. This was loaded into my airbrush with a tiny drop of thinner just to prevent tip dry. I sprayed this onto the lower surfaces of the aircraft, trying to build up some kind of pre-shading. It's ever so simple. There's not really that much in the way of panel lines to actually follow on this kit, so I did kind of try and do some pre-shading and then build up the layers of this paint. It's not massively noticeable in the finished build, but the paint went down generally quite nicely. As a side point, all the colours I'm using in this are from my earlier Airfix version that I built, because actually the Academy kit doesn't have any paint colours listed in the instructions, so I had to go back, check an older build I'd done in the past and see what paints I actually used. The next colour would be this US Air Force brown, and you can see that I've already masked the lower sides of the plane. I did replicate some of the shading on the top using the previous grey colour. Again, I built up layers of this paint, trying to preserve some of that pre-shading to give elements of contrast in the paintwork, but I didn't want it to be too obvious. With that done, I'm going to use this US Forest Green as the final colour in the camouflage scheme. Now, I know that typically a P-40 would more or less have had a fairly hard edge to the camouflage, but because this is a pretty tatty kit, I've decided that I will practice my freehanding techniques. So I dropped down the air pressure, and then I tried to freehand this camouflage scheme onto the aircraft. It took a little bit of time and patience and care to try and go back over a few areas where I kind of messed up a little bit, but actually I kind of got to the point where I was happy and then I was ready to move on. Of course, I did need to make sure that I painted the cockpit canopy with the relevant colour. In this case it would be the green. The next paint I'm going to use is some Outlaw Red. This was airbrushed onto the spinner of the propeller assembly. On the box artwork, it indicates that this has a red spinner, but actually I think in real life the aircraft would have had a brown one. But I thought, why not replicate what Academy have tried to portray on their box artwork? So that's why I went for a red nose. Vallejo Black makes a reappearance, and this would be painted onto the propeller blades to return them back to a black colour. I would also pick out the tips of the propeller blades in yellow off camera. I've already painted the hubs of the wheels with the light grey from earlier, and I very carefully tried to paint the tyres in black as well. Vallejo Camouflage Olive Green would be used to paint the bomb. This was done by hand with only a drop of water added to help the paint flow. Now it's time to give the entire model a gloss coat. Outlaw Gloss was loaded into the airbrush and then sprayed over the entire model. This should help protect the paint, give a nice smooth surface, and help the decals avoid any silvering when I apply them shortly. The decals included in this kit come as a single small sheet. The printing is moderate, and actually these are some of the better quality decals that I've experienced from Academy. However, I do have some concerns with them, such as the sizing of some of the artwork isn't quite right, and there may still be a little bit of excessive decal film in places. I did cut the sheet into more manageable pieces, and then dipped the transfers in warm water to help release them from the backing paper. And if you'd like to get your hands on your own brush water mug so you don't get confused with your cup of tea, check out my merch store. To help me apply these decals, I'm going to be using this Mr. Mark Softer setting solution. A little bit of the setting solution could be added onto the aircraft, the decal slid into place, positioned, and then a little bit more of the setting solution used to help soften them into the surface details. The decal application was relatively straightforward. In comparison to other Academy kits I've built, these actually went down onto the model quite nicely. They're not as thick and papery as I've experienced in other model kits previously. That being said though, perhaps they went a little bit further in the opposite direction. There were times when I thought they were so thin that they would fold over on themselves and effectively become ruined. So I did have to take care here to make sure that didn't happen. There aren't that many transfers included in this kit, so this is a relatively quick step. And thanks to the setting solution and that gloss varnish I applied earlier, I actually found that I had no silvering of the transfer film once these had fully cured. I will just swing back to my previous comment though. I do question how accurate some of these transfers are. Some of them don't seem to be correctly sized when you compare it to images of the real aircraft. The one that I thought I'd have the most trouble with though, the shark's teeth on the nose of the aircraft, actually went onto the plane quite well. A little bit of careful positioning was needed, but on the whole it pretty much goes on without that much trouble. There are a couple of decals as well for the hubs of the wheels, so if my painting hadn't been completely perfect here, it wouldn't have mattered too much. And when the decals had fully cured and settled into the surface of the plastic, another coat of the Outlaw gloss varnish would be applied over the top just to seal them in and help protect them. Vallejo Silver was the next paint to be used, and I would paint it onto the comically short and thick pitot tube on the wing, the landing gear legs, and the mounts for the bomb. I'd also use it on a very fine brush to simulate some chipping around the aircraft. In particular, areas which had perhaps been worn away through crew members walking on the panels, or where panels have been removed for maintenance or rearming. I didn't want to go too crazy with this, but just enough to give an effect. Vallejo Gunmetal Grey would be next, and this would be carefully painted onto the gun barrels on the wings and nose of the aircraft, as well as on the very crude engine exhaust moulding on the sides of the nose. Up next, I'm going to make a little wash. Humbrol 79 blue-grey enamel was thinned down with quite a bit of white spirit. This was painted over the entire aircraft and was allowed to run into all of the recessed details. The recessed panel lines are very subtle, but they do kind of accept a wash. But I'm hoping that this will add a little bit of extra contrast. Excess wash that I wasn't happy with would be carefully removed with a sponge or cotton bud with some more white spirit applied, working in the direction of airflow to try and simulate some dirt and grime streaking across the aircraft whilst it was in flight. The final steps were to add the bomb into the holes on the lower side of the aircraft. These holes are always present, so if you wanted a clean aircraft with no underslung armament or fuel tank, you would have to fill those holes in. The wheels would be glued onto the landing gear legs, and I did have to make a mental note to get them on the right way round because they have decals on now, and apparently one should go on one side and the other on the other, so it was just a little bit of checking the instructions to make sure that I got them the right way round. The propeller can be glued onto the nose. As mentioned earlier, I did modify this part so I could paint it separately. Had you attached it earlier, it could freely rotate. And with those steps complete, this XW10 matte varnish from K-Colors was loaded into the airbrush and sprayed over the entire aircraft to dull down that glossy finish. This should give a much more dull or flat look to the plane. One extra little weathering step I want to do is a little bit of smoke staining, so I'm going to use some of these pigments from Humbrol. And I would use the smoke pigment to simulate smoke staining from the gun barrels. This would be applied with a dry brush into the relevant places and then streaked backwards. I would also replicate this on the nose with the engine exhausts, but I would add a little bit of the rust pigment into this to give a slightly more burnt look to the effect. With that done, I carefully removed the tape and sponge from the cockpit area, which are acting as masks, and then glued into place the included pilot. Humbrol Clear Fix is going to be used to glue into place the clear canopy parts. The side windows need to be glued into place. Actually, I would recommend checking the instructions on this one because from my experience I found that the instructions are like mislabeled and they actually fit better when reversed as opposed to what the instructions tell you. The main canopy though had the masks which I'd applied much earlier on, carefully peeled away, and they seem to have worked reasonably well. And then this too was glued into position on the model. The fit isn't quite perfect, but I'm not really going to do anything to address this at the moment. And that's as far as I'm going to go with my build of the Academy P-40B in 1/72nd scale. And that's another build under the belt. I actually built this one fairly quickly over a couple of days, as I was trying to make sure I could include it in one of my group builds over on the Discord server. The theme of this group build was safari, so any subject with an animal name. I thought a warhawk would be quite appropriate as a hawk is a type of bird, but a warhawk is potentially a little bit more dangerous. Also, extra bonus points, this aircraft features shark's teeth on the nose and also was part of a unit called the Flying Tigers, so that's pretty much a hat trick of animal related theme. So let's talk about this kit then. This is probably one of the worst P-40s that I have built to date. And you might think to yourself, but Matt, it doesn't look that bad, until I start pointing out some of the problems with this kit. So first off, I want to talk a bit about the dimensions. I am a bit of a P-40 fan, and although I'm not an expert, I would say that by just looking at this with my casual knowledge of the plane, the dimensions look a bit off. Just some things I've noticed are the landing gear legs are far too short, the nose is a bit too deep, the cockpit canopy is too far towards the rear of the plane, the cockpit windscreen is too steep, and the vertical tail surface is too small. Not to mention as well that the wings have no dihedral, they are far too flat and level, which all adds to the slightly cartoony style of the plane. Yes, some of these issues could have been addressed, such as making the wings have more dihedral, but the other elements are designed into the kit and thus a little bit more difficult to fix. I think the decals as well, although they went onto the model quite nicely, they're incorrectly sized in some places, so like some of the artwork is far too big and should be considerably smaller. But some of you may already have a bit of a guess as to why this isn't a particularly accurate kit. So there are rumours floating around that this is effectively a copy of a frog tooling, which is considerably older. Academy at some point have been heavily inspired by that frog kit and produced this kit in 1987. Since 1987, which is the tooling date, there have been a number of releases of this, but pretty much in this paint scheme. What you see here is what you get. And whilst it might just be a coincidence that Academy has been inspired by other brands, I'm just going to put a couple pictures of the pilot included in this kit and an Airfix one, and perhaps you can draw some comparisons between them. Another problem with this kit is that the painting instructions are in black and white and make no reference to paint colour callouts, so you have to pretty much use the box art. Which is why I painted it with a red spinner, but in reality I think this would have had a brown one. One of the main things I found quite hilarious was that although Academy did make some improvements, supposedly, to like the frog tooling, by adding recessed panel lines. They're not great panel lines, but they are there. They did include this bomb, and the bomb is, I don't know if it's like too large for the scale or if it's a combination of it being too large and the landing gear legs too short, because actually it contacts the ground, and I thought I'd done this wrong. I thought I'd built the model wrong until I looked up the actual kit on Academy website. So this is an official image from Academy. This is the one they use on the box, and you can see that the bomb actually contacts the ground and prevents the tail from sitting as it should with the wheel touching the floor. I thought I'd done it wrong, but it turns out that no, actually this kit is just this way. So this is less than ideal. Maybe it would have been better to put the drop tank on or leave it without anything on at all. So yeah, I'm just going to put a list of some of the problems I had with this kit on the screen here. Probably not really within my interest to fix these things, given that it was such a cheap kit. And with that in mind, how cheap was this? Well, I've seen it on sale for as low as £4, but typically you'll be looking between sort of £5 and £6 here in the UK at the time I made this video. So if you wanted a cheap kit of a P-40 to mess around with and try new things, then, you know, this would work. But if you wanted a more serious model, which was considerably more accurate, this is not the one I would be recommending to you. If you did want a more accurate version of the P-40 in 1/72nd scale, from my experience, I've built both the trumpeter version and the airfix version. The trumpeter version, granted, is almost twice the price of this, but it does feature a very nice level of detail, and the fit, in my experience, was really quite good. It does also come with 3 paint schemes, which gives you a nice choice. Airfix, on the other hand, tends to release the P-40 at a slightly cheaper price. It does have better quality decals, but each boxing tends to only come with 1 transfer option. However, they have done the exact same paint scheme that I've done here, which is the version I built previously. So yeah, for a better quality version, which may be better value for money, I would suggest looking for the airfix one. A few positives of this kit are that you get lowered or raised landing gear options, and a pilot is included, which I quite like. I think though it's probably time to wrap this one up. This was a relatively simple and quick build, which could be quite fun if you aren't too obsessed with accuracy of a model. I didn't hate building this model kit. I actually quite like the way I've managed to paint this one, but it does annoy me that it's not a particularly accurate looking kit. So yeah, in summary, I'm glad I've had the chance to experience this P-40, but I seriously doubt I'll ever get another one in the future. It's a cheap kit after all, and there are quite a few reasons why it's that cheap. I guess you get what you pay for. And with that, I'm going to leave this video here. Let me know what you think of my build down in the comments, and if my assessment of this kit was fair. As always, quick shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen, and if you'd like to join them or support the channel in other ways, check out the links in the video description. The best way to support the channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.